Hi, this is Dylan Cohen from Sonoma Cutlery, and your chef has asked me to talk to you guys today about knife skills. Now, normally I come into your class and do this in person, but given the circumstances of the shelter in place, we're doing this by video. So I hope this lands, I hope this works, and I apologize you can't ask me questions. But you're always welcome to come into the store and ask me questions or shoot us an email or something like that. It's Sonoma Cutlery, sonomacutlery.com. So anyway, let's talk about knives. I'm here to talk to you about how knives are made, the different styles, the different types, and how to buy them, because as a chef, you're going to be buying knives and using your knives because they're your money makers when you're out in the world. So if you get nothing from this lecture, there's one thing I really want you guys to take away from this. You've got to play with knives, hold knives, feel knives, play with your buddies' knives at the restaurant or in class. You got to make sure you get a knife that fits your hand. The reason we have a 60-foot wall of knives behind us is because everybody's hand is different. So I've got a bunch of knives here. I'm going to be picking up different knives and showing them to you. But they all have a different feel, a different balance, a different weight, a different belly or curve, so they rock a little differently. So it's really important that you get the right knife for your hand. We've been here, 40 years. It's our 40th anniversary. My wife's grandparents started Sonoma Cutlery in 1979. My wife Jody and I bought it in 2000, and we've been running it for 20 years now. And we kind of cater to restaurants, we cater to chefs, we cater to culinary students. We have all of the knives that you could possibly need. And we feel that it's our job to kind of go through all of the knives out there and pick the best ones. So every knife that we have in our store will perform in a professional scenario, in a restaurant, for a caterer. You can beat them up, you can play with them. There's just differences in the blades, differences in the metal, difference in the shape, handle, feel, and that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. Now, there's a lot of other knives out there too. I'm not saying that if we don't sell it, it's a bad knife. There's some good knives out there that we don't sell, and there's a lot of knives out there that we wouldn't bring in our store. And the main reason is there's a lot of companies or brands out there that make their knives too fast. They don't take the time to really make sure the metal's hardened properly. They don't use quality metals in their knives. And so they don't perform as well. They might be cheaper, they might be a good deal, but they won't last you forever. And we believe, kind of our philosophy, is you should buy quality once and have it for life. So any of these knives should last you a lifetime. You take care of them, you maintain them, you sharpen them correctly, and they should last you forever. So anyway, let's talk about knives. So there's three main ways that knives are made. Knives are stamped, forged, or blanked or powdered steel. So in the old days, knives were made, they would take metal and they'd heat it up in a molten pit, and they'd pour it into a mold and break them out and form them and grind them and shape them, and that's how the knives were made. These days, they'll take metal in large bars, cut out the blades, and they heat up the blades until they're molten, red hot, and with a huge forge, they hammer them or shape them. And then they take them out of there, they cool, they temper them, which is a process where they heat up the metal and cool it quickly so the metal becomes dense or hard. The tempering process is probably one of the most important things for the edge retention to make the knife hard. And then they grind them and shape them and taper them and attach the handles, and that's how a modern day forged knife is made. We also have what are called forged knives that have molded handles. So the molded handles is where they actually take the forged knife, but instead of putting a handle on and rivet it, they actually mold the metal, the polyoxyethylene or plastic handles around the blade. Both are the same blade. The blades are both forged. It's just a different style of handle. The molded handles are easier to make, so it's less money because it doesn't take as much process. Doesn't take as many processes to rivet it and grind it down and make the rivet smooth and stuff like that. In the old days, a lot of the knives are made with wood handles. You still can get wood handles these days. The problem is the wood will over time deteriorate, where the plastic or polyoxyethylene handles will pretty much never break down. Wood will eventually. So it's nice, it's got a nice warm feel to it, but you've got to oil them and take care of them. It's a little more work to maintain a wood handle. So that's how a forged knife is made, which is kind of the industry standard. This one right here is the Wusthof Classic 8-inch chef. This is your basic culinary standard 8-inch chef knife from Germany. They've been making pretty much this knife for over 200 years. It's changed over time. The metal's changed, the length of it's changed, little things have changed, but pretty much Wusthof has been doing this for over 200 years. Same thing with Zwilling. Where's my Zwilling knife? Here's my Zwilling knife. It's changed a lot, but it's basically the same knife. Made in the same factory in Solingen, Germany, both of those. So then we have stamp knives. So where a forged knife is the knife's made out of one piece of metal and it's formed and it's shaped, a stamp knife is much lighter. This is an example of a stamp knife. So how a stamp knife is made is they take sheets of metal and they stamp them out like cookie cutters. When the blades fall down, they pick them up, they temper them or harden them, and they attach handles to them, rivet them. But they're a lot lighter. The first thing you notice that the knife doesn't have the bolster or that thick part between the blade. When you forge a knife, you shape everything, so you have the ability to add all, or not add, but work with all this metal to get that shape. The reason for the bolster is it puts most of the weight of the knife in the middle. So when you're holding this, your blade's not a blade handle or handle, it's heavy, blade heavy, handle heavy. The bolster or the center part kind of puts that balance in there, and they can shape it to get that balance right. Every single Wusthof classic 8-inch chef knife you pick up is going to balance right where the bolster meets the handle. And they have the ability to do that because they've got all of this metal that they can grind or shape or taper to make sure it balances like that. So everyone is perfect. Let's talk a little bit about the parts of the knife. This is the handle. This is the blade. The back of the blade is called the spine. When the spine goes through the bolster, which is the part between the blade and the handle, it becomes the tang. I'm sure you've all heard of the saying it's a full tang, 3-riveted knife. So this is a full tang, exposed, 3-riveted knife. The belly is the curve of the blade. The belly determines how much rock the blade has. It rocks like that, as opposed to a knife like this guy that's got a very pronounced belly, which rocks a lot higher like that. So depending on how you like to cook the rock of your knife, you're going to look at different bellies. Some of the Japanese knives have very, very flat bellies. This is a very flat belly, but it's more for chopping, not rocking. All right, so what was I talking about? Okay, the bellies. So because of that weight and that balance, what you'll see here is the spine is very thick and it tapers to a point. More importantly, on a forged knife, since it's shaped out of one piece of metal, it tapers from the spine to the point of the knife. So if you can imagine, that thick spine tapers down to a point. So all the strength of that wide spine goes into that edge. So you have a very strong cutting edge. That's why I'm assuming most industry has been using forged knives for years, because it's a very strong edge. You can really do a lot of work. You can pound on that knife and it's not going to break down. It's going to have a strong edge. Also, the weight of the knife kind of works for you. So when you're cutting, you don't have to apply as much pressure with your arm, because that weight of the heavier blade will help you cut. Where a stamp knife is a lot lighter. Doesn't have all that weight, doesn't have the same balance, although they can balance them pretty good. Anyway, but it doesn't have that weight, so you got to do a little more work. Also, it's got one thickness of metal and they grind an edge, so it doesn't have that same taper. So you usually get a little thinner knife, a lighter knife, and it's not as strong of an edge. But it's a lot less money to make a stamp knife than a forged knife. So you'll see that comparable knives will be 2 to 3 times less money when you're buying them stamped instead of forged. All right, so the final method is called blanked or powdered steels. Powdered steels are much more modern. They've only been around probably for 30, 40 years in the knife industry. So for years, knives were made out of metal that was originally used for something else. You know, you could have been, we've all heard of spring steel. Back in the old days, they would take springs out of cars. In fact, there's some custom knife makers still do that. They get the springs, leaf springs from cars, and they heat them up and pound them and forge them and make knives out of there. It's really hard. Or you've got knives that are made out of files, the old metal files. Those are really, really hard. So knife makers would take that and grind them and shape them and make knives out of them, because it's really hard metal, holds an edge. Both those are carbon steel. What I mean by carbon steel is they will rust. So in the old days, all the best knives were carbon steel knives. This is an old antique carbon steel knife. And you can see all the rust and pitting and black on it. You know, they don't have to be like this. This is an old one that hasn't been cleaned up. But the thing is, carbon steel holds a fabulous, or I should say, carbon steel takes a fabulous edge. You can grind this so thin, razor sharp. You can shave with it. In fact, most all straight razors that are still made are made with carbon steel because you can get them so thin and sharp. Now, they don't hold their edge as well as all these modern metals do, but you can get them razor sharp. And they take that edge easy. Once you've got it sharp and you use it, you can maintain it with your butcher steel and they'll hold their edge really well. The problem is they turn black, they rust, they're dirty looking. So for the majority of Americans, we're all germaphobes over here. We don't like rusty black old knives. So that's why most of the manufacturers have gone to stainless steel knives, because let's face it, America buys most of the products that are made in this world. So the big manufacturers cater to the American customers, and so they started adding stuff to the carbon steel to make it stain resistant. In fact, all the German knives, whether it's a Zwilling, a Sonoma Cutlery, a Wusthof, all these knives today, the metal they use is X50 CRMOV15. So what does that mean? Real easy. X50 is 0.5% carbon. So remember, these knife companies have been making knives for 200 years. 200 years they've been making high carbon steel. Beautiful metal, really sharp, works great, everyone loves it, except it rusts and turns black. So what they did is in the 1970s, 1980s, they added to the carbon chromium. Chromium is a stain-resistant alloy. It's shiny, you know, like the old cars have chrome bumpers, you know, because it shines up, it looks really pretty, but it's soft, it bends, it's malleable. So what happens is they added chromium to the carbon, and then the knife wasn't as hard, it didn't hold its edge as well. So, you know, remember this is the, 1970s, 80s, they had more modern alloys than they had in the 1800s. So what they did is they added, and I'm probably not gonna spell this right, something like that, molybdenum and vanadium. So molybdenum and vanadium are both stainless alloys, and they're really hard. You can harden them up really well. And the 15 says that you've got 15% of that. Now, the one time I was stumped with a question, I was doing my little knife lecture for a cooking school, summer cooking school for kids, and this little 9-year-old asked me, "What's the other 84.5%?" And I didn't know. I was actually stumped, so I had to do a little research. And what it is it's iron. Metal is mostly all iron ore, and then it's what you add to the iron that gives you the characteristics or qualities of that metal. So you've got iron ore that's 0.5% carbon and 15% chromium, molybdenum, and vanadium. That metal, through years of trial and error of adjusting the formula, at one point they added wolfram to it, and wolfram is German for tungsten. But the tungsten, when they added the tungsten to it, it made the metal too hard, and so their sharpening stones, wheels, were wearing out too fast. And so they took it back out. So over the years, they've played with it, and they've determined that this is the perfect steel to use for a right balance, a yin and a yang of hardness. And the hardness, it has to do with your edge retention. Edge retention. And sharpness. And sharpness has to do with the angle of the blade. So how thin that edge is. So we shave with a razor, and razors are usually around 10 degrees. Typically, for years, your German forged chef knife with X50 MOV15 steel, X50 CR MOV15 steel, the edge was about 18 to 20 degrees. Remember I said the razor blade is usually about 10 degrees? So what they determined was this metal hardened at where they hardened it in a German chef knife that's forged with the bolster and the taper of the blade with a 20-degree angle is the perfect balance. It's going to be very sharp and cut through anything you need to cut through. It's going to hold that sharpness well. You're going to be able to steel it easily to maintain that retention. And, you know, it basically will perform optimally with this metal at that angle. And that is true. It does. These work great. These knives are wonderful. You maintain them with your butcher steel. Every time you use them, they're going to hold their edge. They're going to stay sharp. You're going to love them for your life, right? Now, we were talking about powdered steels. So where this metal, it comes into like a soup, where for the most part, it's a 0.5% carbon and most part 15% chromium, molybdenum, and vanadium in the big bar of metal that they're making the knives out of. It's not perfect. Powdered steels are perfect. So what they actually do is they take the elements of the metal in powdered form, and with heat and pressure, they form blanks. That's why we call it blanked. And the blanks are like little bars. And out of those bars, they cut out the blade. And then that blade, they grind, shape, taper, temper, and make your blade out of it. So because it's made with this heat pressure forming out of powdered ore, or elements, for lack of a better word, it's molecularly perfect. You can take a powdered steel knife, cut it, put it on an electron microscope, and you'll see that the elements are lined up perfectly, that it is exactly so much percent of this throughout from the tip to the stern, the whole thing. Some of the modern alloys today, this is a really popular knife. This is the Dragon knife. And this is a BD1N, nitrogen tool steel. So the metal is actually made in America. It's made by Carpenter Steel Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or somewhere in Pennsylvania. And it's really hard. But what's so great about it is that when they make it, instead of being in an oxygen or an air environment, they shoot nitrogen into the process. So it's nitrogen, it's got a nitrogen charged steel, and that alters the carbides of the metal in a certain way, which makes it really, really tough. So this steel, Rockwell, what I mean by Rockwell is how hard. Rockwell's a measurement of hardness. This steel, Rockwell's at 63, where your typical steels are down in the 50s. You know, 54 to 58 is your typical German knife. This stuff, Rockwell's at 63, really hard. And because it's so hard, they can make the edge thinner, and it's not going to dull as fast because the metal's hard and it holds that edge. So these Japanese powdered steels, they actually put 15-degree angles on it. So if your industry if a razor blade is your standard and your typical German chef knife is 20 degrees, if you're doing a 15-degree edge, you're making that edge about twice as sharp as the German knife. Now, if you took a German knife, you could grind it down to 15 degrees and it's going to be just as sharp. The difference is with that metal, it's not going to hold the edge as long as the harder metal will. Because how a knife dulls is that edge, when you cut, that edge will mushroom. And so the harder the metal, the harder it is for it to mushroom. The softer the metal, the easier it is. That's why we don't go and buy Chinese-made knives in Macy's or Walmart or Target, because those are mass-produced really fast. They don't temper them well. They're not as hard, so they just dull really fast. You know, there are some Chinese knives that are great, where they spend the time and the energy to take good steel and temper them correctly and make good knives, but it takes a lot more time to do that, so they're a lot more money. They're not going to be the $10 knives at Walmart. You know what I'm saying? So there's a reason good knives cost more. It takes more work. It takes more expensive metals. And in this case, also great handle material. This is linen micarta, which is fabric and resin that they layer. So no matter what you have on your hand, you've got a grip. You're cutting pork belly with this, you're going to still have a good grip because of the linen micarta. Anyway, I'm getting way off target what we're talking about. Really hard steel, cut it down to a thin edge. Now, usually, if you took a powdered steel and tempered it really hard and you put a real thin edge on it, it makes the knife more delicate. This is a great knife. I actually have this one at home. This is a MAC Superior molybdenum vanadium tungsten alloy. That tungsten's really hard. It's not as stain resistant as other knives because of that. It will discolor if you have like hard water, if you're on a well or something like that, but it doesn't affect the steel in any way. But it's really hard. I, in fact, sharpened mine down to 12 degrees. It's like a razor blade with a handle. I can take it and put it on a watermelon and go right through it. It's like no friction. But I would never think to separate chicken legs from thighs with this knife because it would chip it. I've seen these come in with giant chunks taken out of it because people tried to cut through a frozen sugar cookie roll. Like, oh, crazy. Anyway, they're great knives. They're really sharp. They're really thin. They're fabulous, but they're not as tough or durable as the wider, thicker German knives. This dragon knife is the first time I've seen a Japanese powdered steel knife, because of the nitrogen steel, able to withstand the abuse that any other knife can. You can cut through chicken legs and thighs, you can go through hard shell squash, you can do anything with this knife. And the industry's taken notice. Just this year, we got new knives from Spyderco. These are the Spyderco Murray Carter knives. This is a G10 handle, and it's a very traditional Japanese. These are made in Seki City, Japan. 8-sided handle, but it's BD1 in nitrogen-enriched tool steel again, just like the Dragon knives. Really cool. It's, you know, it's fun because forever knives were knives were knives. And in the last, like I said, 20 years, there's been such crazy advances in metal that we're starting to see some really cool stuff out there, especially in the pocket knife world. Some of these pocket knives are crazy, but now it's starting to blend into the chef knife world. Okay, so we've talked about stamped, we've talked about forged, we've talked about blanked, talked about what's in the metal, the difference, you know, that balance between the hardness of the metal and the angle of the blade. You want to get that right balance. Now, remember the golden rule. While all of this is really interesting, what really matters? How it feels in your hand. Because, you know, there's a dirty little secret out there that I don't know if chefs told you yet. But when you finish your culinary school and you get your degree and you go out there and you get your first job, you're going to be in that kitchen for, you know, 8 days a week in a 150-degree kitchen with 350% humidity, and you're going to be chopping, and chef's going to be over your shoulder saying, chop faster, you're not done yet. And if that blade isn't comfortable in your hand, you're going to be miserable. You don't want to have a sore wrist. You don't want to get blisters. You want to really make sure that the blade fits your hand. So never forget that. You know, I do this lecture a lot, and people are like, ooh, I want that knife because it's got that really cool steel and stuff. But if it's not comfortable, don't do it. You're going to be miserable. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, usually when we do these in person, it's great because people can ask me questions. So I'm trying to anticipate the questions I'll be asked and tell you. All right, let's talk about some other types of steel. So this is a Miyabi, great knife. Why I want to bring up these knives is because they're a laminated knife. So when you laminate something, you're taking two or more different things and you're sandwiching together to make one thing. So this has a CV60 core. So the metal that actually cuts is a CMV60 steel, which is a powdered steel from Japan. And then it's layered with this exterior steel that's etched to make it look like it's Damascus. Damascus or folded steel in the old days, and I'm talking 6,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, the old days, the only way they knew how to harden the metal, like we do now with tempering processes, in the old days, the only way they knew how to harden the metal is to heat up the metal till it's molten, pound it flat with a hammer, fold it over on top of itself, pound that together, and do that continual folding of the metal. And by doing that, they were actually making the molecules of the steel dense, which creates hardness. So you'll hear about these amazing samurai swords in Japan that were folded, 6,000 times. They have no idea how that was done. Today, you fold a knife so many times it breaks. So some of these treasures of folded swords and knives, really, it's a lost art. Nobody knows how they were done. It's really cool. Anyway, This has been etched to make it look like it's Damascus. And then this is a handmade kikuichi, and it's still got the pound marks on it. This is an actual laminated Damascus steel. The core is VG gold powdered steel, and then it's been laminated on each side with this Damascus. They left the pound marks. Sometimes they smooth out the pound marks, you don't see them. Sometimes they leave them. It's mainly aesthetics. It looks good. It also does help with releasing things so they don't stick to it, because you've got layers, so there's a relief in the metal. But for the most part, they laminate the Damascus on the knives to make it look pretty. This is a laminated knife. It doesn't look like, can't even see it. Probably don't see it in the video, but this is a laminate. Now this is a laminate that's actually been done for function. So it's really hard to see, but right along here, there's a line. They call it the hamen. Well, actually, no, that's not true. It'd be a hamen if it was mud baked. Anyway, never mind. They have a line where you can see between the two layers, the core steel and then the side steels. Because this knife, the core is carbon. It's a blue carbon. Rockwell's at 65, really hard, really sharp, amazing, but it's carbon. It's just like the old school carbon knives, it's gonna turn black. If you leave it in water, it's gonna rust. But what they've laminated the sides with is stainless steel. So only that edge will discolor. Most of the knife will stay shiny. Also, another reason they do that's not so important in chef knives, but in swords they do this a lot. They'll put a really hard blue carbon core for that edge, because you can get it really sharp and get that sharp edge. And then they'll laminate the back and the sides of the blade with a softer metal so it's more flexible. So you get, because if the whole thing was that blue carbon and you hit really hard, it could snap. So they put a more flexible, softer steel on the sides and the back to give flex to the blade with the real sharp edge. Not as important with a chef knife, because you're not going to be doing any big wax with this. This is more so you can have the qualities of a carbon steel knife without having to deal with the whole knife turning black or having to maintain it. Also a G10 handle. It's got like a kind of marbleized look. Really cool. These are brand new, amazing knives from Spyderco. Anyway, talked a lot about these guys. Let's talk about some other stuff. So I mentioned the butcher steel, that you need to maintain your knives with a butcher steel. A butcher steel does not sharpen a knife. A butcher steel maintains the edge, or another way of saying it is, if you use your butcher steel, you keep your knife from going dull. So remember I said the physics of how a knife dulls is the edge rolls. The butcher steel pushes your edge straight. So if you cut and you steal, and you cut and you steal, you keep a sharp edge. If you cut and don't steal, cut and don't steal, cut and don't steal, it eventually will roll over. Now the steel has nothing to push up. It can't push that straight. It can't hone it. You actually need to sharpen the knife, and the distinction sharpening is grinding metal off. So every time you sharpen your knife, you're taking a little bit of metal off. So let's say a chef knife like this, you've got maybe 20 sharpenings in until it's no longer an 8-inch chef knife. If you are religious, now with a home cook, you grab your knife to cook dinner, you steal it, you cook dinner, you wash it, you put it away. The next time you grab your knife, if you get in that habit that every time you pull your knife out, knife will stay sharp for years. Now, for a professional scenario, like a restaurant or a caterer where you're using your knife all day long, usually the rule of thumb is you steal your knife between every process. So you cut the carrots, steal your knife, cut the onions, steal your knife, go on like that. So you might steal your knife 20 or 30 times a night. But that's really important, because if you steal your knife religiously and you avoid sharpening your knives every 5 to 10 years, let's say you sharpen it every 5 years, you take metal off. You got 20 sharpenings in a knife, that is a 100-year knife. You're gonna have it forever. But if you're not so religious and you're cutting on those plastic boards, which just dull knives, and you're sharpening that knife every 6 months, you've got a 10-year knife. So the question is return on investment, ROI. Do you want to invest in a good knife and have it for 10 years or 100 years? So that's why using your butcher steel is so important. Now, we got two other types of steels. This is a diamond steel, and this is a ceramic steel. So this is an abrasive metal that they basically manufactured or grown man-made diamonds, like, well, I guess you call them like cubic zirconium on them, but it causes a really abrasive edge. So when you pull your knife down that, it's not straightening the edge, it's cutting the edge off. Same thing with a ceramic. This is a stone and it's abrasive, so it takes it off. The difference is diamonds are much more abrasive, so they cut faster, but they leave a rougher edge, where ceramic doesn't cut it off as fast and it leaves a much smoother edge. But they both work, they do the job. So, all right, let's look at my outline here. We've talked about different ways knives are made. We've talked a little bit about the tradition of how we've evolved from carbon steel knives to the modern alloys that we have today. We've talked about the German knives and the Japanese knives and the hardness and that balance between edge retention and angle or sharpness of blades. Now I want to talk about the Swiss knives. So this is a Victorinox or Forstner butcher knife. First thing you notice, everyone's like, what are those little things on the side? These are called Grantons. Well, they're only called Grantons if you're an ethical company and you give money to Mr. Granton's great-great-grandkids as royalties for using the word Granton. Granton was a butcher in the UK, probably, I don't know, 100, 200 years ago. I don't know when he lived. And he was the first one to put grooves on the side of the knife. And basically why is, if you're cutting something with a smooth edge and the object you're cutting is wet, the wetness creates a suction with that smooth blade. So if you can imagine, you've got a side of beef sitting there and you've got your old school butcher knife that's smooth, and you got that side of beef and you're cutting off a big chunk of that beef, all this smooth surface is going through raw meat, which is wet, and it's creating suction, so they're pulling on it. So that force of that pulling is causing you to get tired in your shoulder, and so you're gonna beat yourself up for no reason. So if you put these Grantons on that blade, you're now putting air between the blade and what you're cutting, so the blade glides through the meat easier. Now, they're called Grantons. If you don't want to pay a royalty to the Granton family, you call them Kulenschlitz, or hollow grinds in English. So there's a lot of different words for it, but basically it does the same thing. So it went from the butchering knives to the carving knives. So again, carving knives, you're cutting rare meat, your roasts, turkeys, whatever. You're cutting through rare meat's wet. It's hot and wet. So you want to break that suction so you glide through it, and you can cut thinner when you do that, break that suction like that. From there, it evolved to chef knives, which is, really great. Cutting onions, potatoes, it's not going to stick as much. Is it perfect? No. Stuff will still, you get a real wet potato, it's still going to stick to the side of it, but it's not going to be as bad where you're like chasing the piece of potato around the blade to get it off. Anyway, back to the point, why I was talking to you about Swiss knives. So Victorinox are made in Switzerland, and here's the deal. They've got all the technology, equipment, ability to make these just as hard as the German knives, but they make them softer on purpose. Now, this is normally the time I'd ask you, anybody know why? And everyone has to raise their hand and give their ideas of why they do that. But the truth is, a butcher, like I said, if you've ever seen a butcher work, it's crazy. They're fast. I don't know how any of them have any fingers left because they're just, flying arms and knives. But you've got a side of meat. The butchers usually have a scabbard. Up there, we got some scabbards. They wear scabbard on a chain with their butcher steel on the other side like this, hanging there. So they're cutting meat, cutting a piece of meat, and then they're dropping it down, staking it up. So if this knife is not razor sharp and they're fighting it, they're gonna get tired. So a butcher wants their knife to be razor sharp all the time so it glides through that raw meat easily. So they make it softer on purpose because a butcher will do like 1 or 2 cuts, steal their knife. A few more cuts, steal their knife. They're constantly stealing their knife. That's why the steel hangs on a chain on their hip. So it's softer, not so because it dulls, they're softer so it will steel straight quicker. It's actually designed that way so they can steal them easier to keep that knife razor sharp. All right, what else do we got to talk about? We talked about all that. Let's spend some time now talk about the different knives. It's fun to come down and see the whole wall of knives and play with the different ones. But right now I'm going to spend some time and talk to you just about, some differences. So this is your traditional paring knife. This is a 3.5-inch pair, which is kind of like the common size. These come between 2.5 to 4.5 inches. Anywhere in that range is a paring knife. Over 4.5 inches, if you get to 5, 6, those become utility knives. This is also a paring knife, but this is a tournée or a bird's beak peeler. And it's got that little curve to it like a beak of a bird. And it's designed for peeling. So if you take a round object like an apple and you do the peeling like this, the curve of that blade goes around the curve of the apple and you can peel more of the material off with each cut. So your tournée knife or your bird's beak peeler. What kind of knife is this? This is a boning knife. This is a stiff boning knife. This is also a boning knife, a stiff boning knife. They've got the same curve to the blade, which is what's important about a boning knife. This is your more traditional European style. This is a more butchering style boning knife, but they both do kind of the same job. You're taking meat off the bone, you're getting through and breaking joints and doing stuff like that. You can also use them to fillet small fish like trout, stuff like that with these smaller 5, 6-inch boning knives. We also have this guy, which is a boning knife, but it's flexible. So a flexible boning knife is nice because it'll flex around the bone so you actually can get more meat off the bone with each cut. So it increases your production. Is one better than the other? No. A stiff boning knife you have more control over. A flexible boning knife will curve around that bone so you can get more work done with it. It's more of an issue of comfort. Which one's more comfortable for you? And then there's this guy. Looks like a utility carving knife, but it's flexible. This is a fillet knife. Fillet knives will flex like that. You can bend them down. You take the skin off your fish, do things like that. It's a very thin one. They come in all shapes and sizes, from 6 inches to 12 inches to straight to curved. There's tons of fillet knives out there. And what is this? This is a serrated knife. This is a bread knife. Here's another serrated knife. This is a tomato knife, just because it's smaller. The fork, you can use that to take the pit out of the tomato. You're gonna take the pit out. Or it's also great for sausages. If you're on the barbecue, you can cut it and Anyway, the serration, that's what's important about tomato knives and bread knives. A serrated knife. So, serrated knife looks like this, right? The points or the fingers don't actually do the cutting. The point of the knife is what holds the object you're cutting. So let's think about a hard crusted sourdough bread. If you were to take your chef knife and try to cut that bread, you're gonna push until it's flat and then it's gonna crunch through it, right? Where the points of the serrated knife, the fingers will pierce the crust and hold it. And then the cutting is actually done on the inside of the blade. That is why if you go to somebody's house that isn't so good about keeping their knives sharp, they'll cook the whole dinner with the bread knife. Because all the other knives are dull, but the bread knife will still saw through everything. Because the part that hits the cutting board is the fingers right here, and the part that actually does the cutting is inside that. So they don't dull as fast because they don't hit the cutting board. The cutting board is what dulls the knife. So that's the deal with serrated knife. Now serrated knives, because it's more of a sawing or a tearing, they don't cut as thin. So while this is great to cut a tomato, if you have a sharp chef knife or utility knife, you can actually cut a lot thinner slices of that tomato if it's sharp. The problem is if your chef knife or your utility knife is dull, it's gonna smush that tomato. You know what I'm saying? Where the serrated will pierce the skin and cut it. So serrated knives are good for anything with a crust or a skin. Sausage, tomato, hard crusted breads, like that. Now, common mistake. People think this is a bread knife. And at first, they actually put bread knife on the box, but then they realize it's really not. This is the opposite of bread knife. This is called a wavy knife. And this one, being an offset 8-inch wavy, is what's called a deli or panini knife. So this blade actually looks like this. It's the opposite of a serration. It's got that wavy edge. Now, these are actually really cool. This is, your all-around deli prep knife. Really great. You cut tomatoes with it, lettuce, soft breads, your sandwich, your panini. You make your old bologna sandwich right through it. It's really great. The offset, you don't hit your knuckles on it. But here's what's cool about it. Just like with the serrated knife, the only part that hits the cutting board is right there on the bottom. So 80% of the cutting edge doesn't hit the board, so it stays sharp longer. So in a deli situation, prep cook situation, where you're just going through bushels of tomatoes and stuff like that, it's a great knife because it holds that edge well. You can still steel it. It's sharpened on one side. You see the sharpness there and it's flat there. So your angle is up on this side. You go down like that, and then you lay it perfectly flat and push it straight so they can still be steeled. All right. What's this? This is a cleaver. This is a meat cleaver. Boom, boom, boom. You go through bones, cartilage, whatever. They're heavy. They're dull. If this was sharp, they would chip. But these are so big and thick and dull that they'll go through that cartilage, that bone, without breaking or chipping. That is distinctly different from a vegetable cleaver. This is a nikiri, or a very small or thin vegetable cleaver. Now this is sharp, 15-degree edge, and this is designed for vegetables. If you try to go through bone or cartilage with this, you chip it up, make it a serrated knife. But this will slice your tomatoes and your lettuce and stuff like that easy. From that Japanese nikiri style small cleaver comes the santoku. This is a very popular knife the last 20 years. This is basically a German variation of a Japanese nikiri. As you can see, they're very similar except for that curve on the top. That's the only difference, but the blade is very common. The Grantons are kind of like the signature of the santoku. Yeah, and that's that. So anyway, I've talked to you about a lot of knives. Don't forget the most important thing. I'm just going to sum up here for you guys, because as culinary students, you're going to be out there shopping for knives. You're going to be looking for knives. So, number one, buy what feels good in your hand. Shop at a store that has a good selection. Spend time holding all of the knives, playing with the different handles. It's completely okay. I really want you to get this. It's completely okay to come in here and say, I want to play with 9-inch chef knives, and I'll take down all 39-inch chef knives, and we'll lay them down here, and you'll play with them. Right away, half of them are going to be uncomfortable. We'll put them back on the wall. And sit there, spend an hour or two. Play with them. Make sure you get the right one for your hand. Number two, don't get stuck trying to match your knife set. I don't know any chef that's been in industry for any amount of time that has all the same brand in their knife set. I'm telling you, the Wusthof chef knife might be the most comfortable for you, but the Dragon boning knife feels better in your hand. And, Sonoma cutlery bread knife, they all kind of feel the same. Why not go with the cheapest one? Sonoma cutlery is the best deal because we bring them in direct, so don't, like that. Also, let's say you work at a macrobiotic vegan restaurant where all you're doing is chopping vegetables, and you've got your beautiful Japanese knives and get really thin cuts. And twice a year you volunteer at your church for the roast beef feed. Don't go out there and buy a $200 roast beef carver. Go get the rubber handle, $40 inexpensive roast beef carver for the couple times a year you do it. There's no sense doing that. Does that make sense? Number three, now this is kind of our plug. Shop at a store that caters to chefs. So when you shop at Sonoma Cutlery and you're a culinary student or a restaurant owner or a chef in a restaurant or a caterer, anybody in the industry, we have an industry discount. So most all of our knives, except for Spyderco and the handmade kikuichis, you get 25% off. The Spyderco and kikuichis, because they're handmade like that, there isn't as much. Anyway, they're only 10% off. And then any accessory you need, peelers, bags, steels, all of that stuff's 10% off also. In fact, if you come in and convince me that you need a pocket knife to open the boxes of lettuce in your restaurant, I'll give you 10% off a pocket knife too. Just because, we're too trusting. Anyway, so that's the industry discount. It's not just us. if you're in Manhattan and you're working at the restaurant du jour and you need a knife and you go down to the Brooklyn kitchen and you're like, hey John, I need a boning knife. I'm the new sous chef at restaurant du jour. He's gonna give you a discount on that too, because we cater to chefs and chefs take care of us. It's kind of that symbiotic relationship. The other thing is, you want a store that's going to be able to educate and explain the differences. You can come in here, we can talk about steels, we can totally geek out on metal, man. I'm there all day. Let's talk about the metal, handles, blades, like that. And extra service, we do sharpening. We sharpen by hand. We use wheels made out of cardboard that we put jeweler's rouge on it. Excuse me. So we put a high polished razor edge on your blade. So it's got a nice smooth edge. It's going to cut easily. But most importantly, we take off very little metal. There are some knife sharpeners out there that use belt sanders. These guys drive around in trucks and they've got these setups with these belt sanders. Man, they will take a 1/4 inch off your knife in 30 seconds if they're not careful. What I gotta say about that is be aware, be bold. If you're gonna have someone sharpen your knife, say, hey, let me see what you use. Check it out. You don't want to give somebody a $100, $200 knife and have them destroy it or take 20 years off of it in 30 seconds. So these are your babies. These are what make you money, and you want to get a good ROI or return on investment on them, so you want to take care of them. The best person really to sharpen your knife is you, because it's your knife. You know what you like. You know the angle you like. You can get that perfect. But we all know that most chefs working way too many hours, way too long nights, and you don't want to, waste another few hours sharpening your knife. So it's normal to want to take it somewhere to be sharpened. Just investigate, make sure you get somebody that's going to take care of your knife. Okay, finally, ways to buy knives. So the best way to buy your knife is to come in and play with all the chef knives and find that one chef knife that's best for you. Then play with all the bread knives and find that one bread knife that's best for you. And it's great. You'll get 25% off or 10% if you're buying the handmade stuff. And you'll get a great knife. You get exactly what you want. We've got a wall of bags. You can get your pink bag or camouflage. Hey, we've got this new bag that's got little white pigs on it. It's really cute. Anyway, we got fish, and also, you can totally deck yourself out. We're going to give you the industry discount. You're going to have a great set of knives that are custom made for you. Now, another way to do it is to buy prepackaged sets. So we've got some beautiful kits we've put together with the bare essentials up to, a lot of different knives, and we've really discounted them. So you can get a Sonoma cutlery set that's got 3 knives up to 5 knives in the bag. You can get a Wusthof set. We've got a Dragon set. We've got we just put together a Hinkle Zwilling 4-star set. Great sets, really good prices. But here's the deal, you're not stuck with what's in the set. A lot of students will come in and get the Sonoma cutlery set because it's really inexpensive for really high quality hand-forged German knives. But then they may swap out the chef knife for another chef knife that fits their hand better. Let's say you just love the belly of that Dragon knife with that Linda Micarta handle. You're like, I love this knife. So give me the Sonoma cutlery set and let's swap out the Sonoma cutlery chef knife with the Dragon chef knife. We will totally do that. We'll give you a credit for the Sonoma cutlery knife. We'll sell you the Dragon knife at 25% off, and you'll have exactly what you want. So we're here to take care of you. So come on down, check us out, enjoy your knives, love your knives, buy them once, have them forever. Thanks. Have a great day.